Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephen Sheck. I am the chair of the Jewish Community Relations Council of the Greater Miami Jewish Federation, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the Miami Book Fair. The Federation is proud to sponsor this session, and I'm truly grateful to see so many of you here for a conversation of real significance. As the advocacy arm of our Jewish community here in Miami, the JCRC works to build strong and meaningful relationships with our state and local legislators, school board members, and leaders across Miami's diverse communities, including our Christian, Latino, Black, Haitian, and LGBTQ partners. We believe deeply in dialogue, collaboration, and the idea that communities are stronger when they stand together. Those values feel especially relevant today as we gather to discuss a topic that demands our attention: anti-Semitism in America. We are honored to have Dr. Pamela Nadell with us to share insights from her important new book on anti-Semitism in America. And guiding this conversation is Lisa Hostein, whose distinguished career in Jewish journalism brings depth and clarity to discussions like this. I'll be reading their full bios in a second. So thank you for being here, for your engagement, and for your commitment to understanding and controlling this important issue. So let's begin. So first, I'd like to introduce Dr. Pamela Nadell. She holds the Patrick Clenenden Chair in Women's and Gender History and directs the Jewish Studies program at American University. Her work includes America's Jewish Women, A History of Colonial Times to Today, winner of the 2019 National Jewish Book Awards, Jewish Book of the Year. And it actually has been translated into Hebrew, I just found out, and so she's making that tour in Israel soon. So she also wrote Women Who Would Be Rabbis, A History of Women's Ordination from 1889 to 1985. Nadell is the past president of the Association of Jewish Studies, and she lives in North Bethesda, Maryland. Interviewing Dr. Nadell is Lisa Hostein. She is the executive editor of Hadassah Magazine, which is one of the largest circulation Jewish publications of the United States. And my wife and my daughters are both lifetime members, so I was happy to say that as well. So her previous experience includes serving as editor-in-chief of the JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, the Global Jewish News Agency. She has won numerous journalism awards throughout her career, including from the Pennsylvania News Media Association, the Pennsylvania chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists, and the American Jewish Press Association, which also has honored her with its Simon Rockover Award. So please join me in a great conversation, really important for today. Join me in welcoming Dr. Pamela Nadell and Lisa Hostein.
Thank you so much all for being here at the end of this amazing Miami Book Fair. Those of you who have stuck it through to the end, we really appreciate it, and I hope you feel it was an important, worthwhile reason to stay. I am just thrilled to be partnering with the Miami Book Fair for this episode of Hadassah Magazine Presents, which is a podcast that features Jewish authors, thinkers, and celebrities. Anti-Semitism today is a burning issue in our country and indeed in many parts of the world, and not just for Jews, which is why it's also a very important issue for Hadassah, the Women's Zionist Organization of America, which is the largest Jewish women's organization in the United States, and it's also the publisher of Hadassah Magazine. For these reasons, that's why it's so important that I'm here today with Pam Nadell, who's an important historian and has written a really seminal, groundbreaking, and timely book, Antisemitism in American Tradition. There is no question that we are living in a time where Jewish fear and insecurity is something that we haven't seen in decades. And in her book, she talks about the history of anti-Semitism in America, and it's our goal to talk both about the history and contemporary anti-Semitism. I was going to share a bunch of statistics, but I don't want to bore you with those because statistics don't really matter that much. However, there are a few things that I do want to share with you. The Anti-Defamation League, which is the organization that tends to track anti-Semitic incidents, in 2024 tabulated 9,354 anti-Semitic incidents across the United States. This represented a 5% increase from the incidents in 2023, a 344% increase over the past 5 years, and an 893% increase over the past 10 years. It's the highest number since the ADL began tracking these incidents 46 years ago. Now, maybe some people don't necessarily agree with the way the ADL counts incidents, but there's no question, I think anybody who's paying attention knows that there's a tremendous amount of fear and insecurity in the community right now. Jewish synagogues, schools, institutions, all have armed guards outside their buildings these days. That was something that's been happening in Europe for years, and I don't know, 7 years ago was absolutely unthinkable. But even my small little synagogue in the suburbs of Philadelphia has an armed guard every single Friday night. So we're looking at this at a time when, beyond the statistics, you just have to look at this past week at 2 incidents that I want to point out, because I think that means more than statistics. Last week, there was a gathering at a major synagogue in Manhattan where Jews were gathering to think about moving to Israel. These organizations sponsor potential Aliyah participants. There was a huge mob outside the synagogue, very close to the entrance, harassing everybody who was entering the synagogue, yelling things like, "Let's make them scared." Even more egregious, I have to say, in my opinion, was something that happened just Thursday at Union Station in Washington, D.C. There was a group that one media outlet portrayed as guerrilla art, which was a staging of a Friendsgiving that featured U.S. and Israeli leaders drinking the blood of Gaza children. Now, anybody who knows anything about Jewish history knows that this is one of the most vitriolic libels against the Jews that often ended in a lot of violence. So, Pam, it's against this backdrop that I want to delve into with you both historical and contemporary anti-Semitism. So I'm going to start with kind of the obvious question, which is, what motivated you to write this book? I know that you started before October 7th.
Well before October 7th. The first thing I want to say is thank you so much, and especially thank you to Hadassah for bringing me here to this amazing book fair and for having this conversation with you. This book is not, as you well know, it's not a post-October 7th book. I don't think I have to explain October 7th, 2023 to anybody in this room, but for those watching this on C-SPAN, that was the day when Hamas terrorists invaded Israel, murdered 1,200 people, captured 251 hostages, and unleashed, as they surely knew they would, a horrific war against Gaza. And this book really came out of the fact that on October 27th, 2018, 11 Jews in a synagogue in Pittsburgh were gunned down. That murder at the Tree of Life Synagogue shocked Pittsburgh Jews. It shocked the Pittsburgh community. Maybe some of you remember how the headline of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette actually opened a few days later with the Kaddish prayer that Jews say, their prayer for the memorial of the dead. It opened with it in Hebrew letters, splashed across its front page. And that event shocked American Jewish historians. I'm a member of a tiny little circle of this group, and we wondered, how had we missed the story of anti-Semitism as so powerful in American life that Jews would be gunned down in their synagogue?
You were close to completing the book when October 7th happened. Did it change in any way both the actual outcome of the book or the way you were thinking about this issue?
October 7th didn't change the outcome of the book, except for the fact that as I was working on the book, I hadn't finished it yet, and obviously I knew that I had to talk about October 7th. And for a historian, that's really difficult because we historians like to have distance. But it was a subsequent horrible murder that actually did change the very end of the book. Some of you will remember that in May of this year, a beautiful young couple was gunned down outside the Capitol Jewish Museum as they were leaving an event that the American Jewish Committee, a historic Jewish organization, had convened for young Jewish professionals. And a man, the alleged murderer, who yelled, "Free Palestine," shot this beautiful young couple. And the woman, Sarah Milgram, had graduated my university only 2 years before. And I knew the book had not gone to press, and I said, I need to add this event to this story, but I also know that there's going to be another one and another one and another one that will make this book dated.
And I remember calling you a few days after that, a little hesitantly, because usually I don't like to write for the magazine before your book comes out, but I begged you to write a piece, and I asked you to address the question, is this a turning point? And we'll get back to later what your response was and continue that conversation. But I do want to go back in history for a minute. Your book, the premise of your book is that anti-Semitism has been present in this country since the arrival of the first Jews in 1654, and it has continued to ebb and flow ever since then. Can you pinpoint a period or periods that prior to the last 7 years here were the worst in American history?
For historians, the worst period of anti-Semitism in American history has traditionally been the years between World War I and World War II. And the reason for that is that the first thing that happens in the 1920s is all sorts of what we would call structural restrictions get imposed on the Jews. And the people who are doing this are very proud of what they're doing. A. Lawrence Lowell, president of Harvard, publishes a defense of the quota he established at Harvard on the front page of the New York Times. And ultimately, 700 colleges and universities have quotas on the number of students who they admit. Want ads. Most people under a certain age will have no idea what I'm talking about, but it used to be that if you wanted to rent an apartment or get a job, you opened your morning newspaper. And those want ads, they could read both for jobs and for housing, Christians only or Gentiles only. And then when we move into the 1930s, these restrictions are in place, but then we also have a very powerful Nazi movement in America, funded, we know, by the Nazi government in Germany, and they begin physically harassing Jews, literally beating them up on the streets of cities like New York and Boston.
You know, I'm struck by the numbers of Jews in this country over the period, and you cite that on the eve of the Civil War, there were 150,000 Jews. And by the end of that century, the 19th century, there were already 1 million Jews. And now there are roughly 5.8 million Jewish adults, according to 2020 figures. But the percentage of the population that the Jews comprise has grown only slightly from the end of the 19th century, from about 2% to about 2.4% in 2020. Have you seen any correlation between the number of Jews and the degree of anti-Semitism, or there's not a connection?
The place where there's a correlation was in this period of the 1920s, because one of the things that happens is that in the 1920s, not only did the quotas come in and these restrictive laws about, where Jews could live and where they could work, but what also happens in this period is that the government establishes a quota system for immigration to the United States. And we know, if you read through, as I did, congressional testimony, we know how the government was deliberately trying to keep out Jews. And that was the point, that was sort of the end point where the Jewish population of America had grown to well over 2 million. By 1940, it would be 4 million. But otherwise, to be honest, the number of Jews in America, it does not affect anti-Semitism, just as it does not affect anti-Semitism around the world, because there's anti-Semitism in places that have absolutely no Jews.
So that actually is a good segue into my question that we don't usually ask, or I don't usually ask. And I'm wondering if your research into this book shed any additional light for you on why people hate Jews. We know it's the oldest hatred in the world, but how do you answer the question that I suspect you get from your students, we get from our children and our grandchildren? Why this hatred?
Right. Why hatred of a people that is 0.1% of the world's population? The anti-Jewish animus begins long before the word anti-Semitism was ever coined. The word anti-Semitism doesn't even appear until the late 1870s. But people have hated Jews. I mean, we could go all the way back to Exodus and Pharaoh. But the real starting point for anti-Jewish hatred in the Western world comes with the birth of Christianity. And if you read through the Gospels carefully, you will see quotations about the devil being the father of the Jews worshiping in the synagogue of Satan. And that motif is so powerful that almost every time I give one of these talks, somebody comes up to me afterwards and says, you know, when I went to college, they wanted to see someone who's Jewish, they wanted to see my tail or my horns.
And you heard those examples. We were sitting together at dinner the other night, even from 1970s.
Exactly.
Which I did not think was still happening then. I mean, that was when I was young and through the 80s and 90s. And that leads to another question. Many people have talked about the golden age for American Jewry, and there's some debate. In fact, you have a chapter that said no age is golden. But I think the reality is that you and I grew up in a time, and a lot of people here, when it was almost a non-issue, except for these rare instances, even though you keep hearing these examples. But generally speaking, it was not the same degree. So what changed?
The first thing to say is that what changed and it didn't happen immediately after World War II, but once we get to the U.S. Civil Rights Act of 1964, so many of the discriminations that had really barred Jews in America, the inability to live in certain neighborhoods, the corporations that refused to hire them, those quotas in colleges and universities, those all became illegal. And once that happens, we do see Jews rushing into the breach, and we have this sense, as you said, that we were living through a golden age because the structural discriminations against Jews had fallen. But one of the things that I was able to do in this research, which is why I called No Age Entirely Golden, is that thanks to the tools we have today, the digitization of local community newspapers, I was able to develop a database of arson, attacks, violence, bombings, failed bombings because the bombs didn't go off, and even murder that had occurred against Jews in that period of the Golden Age. But we didn't know about the story because they were local attacks and they hadn't made headlines. That's why I called that chapter No Age is Golden.
Very interesting. And I know that you've said you were very instrumental in helping develop the museum, now the Weitzman Museum of American Jewish History in my town, Philadelphia. And it's a beautiful museum, and yet there's virtually nothing about anti-Semitism. So clearly it wasn't on the radar.
Right. I was one of the founding historians of the Weitzman National Museum of American Jewish History. Our exhibit is now about 20 years old, was definitely created in what we were thinking of as the Golden Age. And we're well aware now that we didn't have a lot about anti-Semitism in there. It's a museum that sits on Philadelphia's Independence Mall. We were thinking about the choices and challenges that freedom had posed to American Jews. And I can assure you that we are already in conversation about redoing that exhibition, and also about creating a new small exhibition that will talk about, we'll actually hear from voices of people today who have experienced anti-Semitism.
Have you begun to speculate at all how you would approach that?
We have a pretty good sense because we have examples for, I'll give you just one, we'll probably get this voice, of a young man at the University of Pittsburgh who was assaulted coming home one Friday night. And I happen to know the story. Not only did it make national headlines, I know the story because it was the son of the head of our federation.
Interesting, because I actually know of another case from Pittsburgh, and I know the family from Philadelphia. So there must have been more than one example, even at Pittsburgh. So the sources of anti-Jewish hate has evolved over time, and it now is clearly coming from both the right, white Christian nationalist movement and the anti-Zionist left. So how would you explain and describe the evolution of the sources of hate in this day and age?
That anti-Semitism comes now from the right and the left is what makes this moment, I think, the high tide of American anti-Semitism. From the right, it has old origins. We have, when the immigrants are coming in, we have a movement to stop immigration into America. I'm talking about when the Russian Jews are coming in the late 1890s and early 1900s, and they're charging Jews, poor East European Jews, with trying to replace the rightful inhabitants of America, which are the Christian white nationalists. And from the left, anti-Semitism from the left comes straight out of the Soviet Union, but people don't remember this. They don't know the origins of it. The Soviet Union outlawed anti-Semitism, but it was deeply anti-Zionist, and its promotion of anti-Zionism is something that the contemporary left has picked up without understanding what they're doing.
Could you go a little deeper? Because I think people do get confused and not everybody's on the same page of what anti-Zionism means. And I think even in the American Jewish community, there's always been discussion whether criticism of the Israeli government or policies is just anti-Israel, anti-government, or whether it veers over, spills over into anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And I think that there's a little bit more of a consensus now in the American Jewish community that it's hard to separate anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. So can you unpack that for us?
Anti-Zionism is the movement that opposes the existence of the State of Israel. To be critical of the government of Israel is as acceptable as it is to be critical of any government that one has differences with. And often, and especially before October 7th, we often heard the argument that criticizing the government of Israel is definitely not anti-Semitic. Yet, to use the example from the Union Station from this week, when anti-Zionists trot out classic anti-Semitic canards that Jews are the people who need the blood of others, who drink the blood of others, who use it for their religious purposes, it's crossed the line. There's no question that it's crossed the line to anti-Semitism. When I think of anti-Zionism, the other thing I want to say about it is I want to think about the outcome of anti-Zionism. I've been in all these meetings, you probably have too, where a colleague is sitting there and he says to me, I'm not anti-Semitic. And then he says, I just don't believe Israel has the right to exist. 45% of the world's Jews live in Israel. But what has been the outcome of anti-Zionism in other places? Soviet Jews had to leave. They struggled to leave. They fled both during the Soviet Union and then immediately after its collapse. But what about the anti-Zionism that burst out in the Middle East in Iraq and in Algeria and in North Africa? What happened to those communities? In Iraq, in 1948, they outlaw Zionist sympathies, they outlaw pro-Zionism, and within 3 years, over 90% of Iraqi Jews fled. Same thing happened in Morocco, same thing happened to the Jewish communities all across North Africa and the Middle East. So if anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, how come the Jews in those places are gone?
This is a good segue to what's going on in college campuses. You are based on a college campus, American University, and clearly the vitriol and the activity has come from the anti-Zionist left for the most part. So first of all, there's a history to what's going on in the campus, and you discuss this in your book. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
The history of policies towards Jews on college campuses really goes back to the exclusion of the quota systems as I said, at 700 colleges and universities starting in the 1920s and frankly continuing well into the 1970s. Even Deborah Lipstadt, the former ambassador in the State Department to combat and monitor anti-Semitism around the world, she's written that when she was growing up, she knew that there were so many schools that she could not possibly apply to. So it took a while for that system to be dismantled, but we also know that the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement begins to gain root and traction at colleges, starting at Berkeley, the University of California at Berkeley, in the late 1990s. Out of opposition to the Oslo Accords, the Palestinian movement began a concerted effort where it actually said, we're going to transform the campuses into places that are going to support boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and are going to be anti-Israel. So what happened after October 7th, when everybody's so shocked about the 30 student groups at Harvard within days of October 7th, blaming Israel for all unfolding violence. This is way before the war started. Everyone's shocked by that. I wasn't shocked by that because that had been brewing for a very, very long time with events like the spring event on most college campuses of putting up an Israel apartheid wall, or the various speakers that they had been bringing. And even as early as 2002 or 2003, there was a letter published in the New York Times signed by 300 college and university presidents where they were speaking out saying they would be supporting Jewish students who were already being ostracized on their campuses.
And I think reporting has come out, and I actually remember when I was at JTA reporting out of the Durban conference in South Africa, which people don't realize was really the birth of this movement and the determination that BDS was going to be the strategy with which to approach anti-Israel activity on the campuses. And, like you said, a lot of us were shocked by the degree that unraveled in the past couple of years, but it's not new.
What's so striking about the Durban conference, which most people don't remember, was a United Nations conference against racism and xenophobia, and the anti-Israel crossing the line to anti-Semitism on display at that conference was so horrific that not only did the Israeli delegation leave the conference, but so did the U.S. delegation. And the U.S. delegation, among its members, was Congressman Tom Lantos, the only member of Congress ever to have survived the Holocaust. And he said the anti-Semitism he saw there was worse than anything he had seen in Budapest under the Nazis.
And of course, Durban didn't get as much coverage as it might have because it basically coincided with 9/11. So it got buried to a large degree. So tell us a little bit about what your experience on campus has been this year and what you're hearing from students and what you're seeing. Again, I think American was maybe a little quieter than most schools, but I'm sure you talked to a lot of your colleagues. How would you describe what's happening this year as opposed to the last couple of years?
The first thing that I would say is that American University, we banned encampments. I can tell you we had students who went to a neighboring university so they could join it, but at our campus, we banned it. But got pushback from some faculty. You know what? I don't really care. I was in conversation with the president's office that this needed to be done.
How instrumental were you in making that happen? Tell us a little bit about how.
I got called a lot. They knew I was working on this book, and every time something happened, I would get a phone call, even though I was supposedly on sabbatical writing. But what's happened is this year has been quieter. So was last year. What we know, because Hillel International did a survey, is that last year encampments on college campuses were down 94%. Vandalism was down 50%, which is still too high, but is certainly much better than the year before. But where anti-Semitism has exploded is on social media. And social media in the last academic year on college campuses, anti-Israel, anti-Semitic social media, was up almost 200%.
And I believe you're teaching a class on anti-Semitism, using your book, I presume, at American. Are the students all Jewish, or are there some non-Jewish students, and what are you hearing from them? What are they seeking in terms of understanding this better?
The first thing that I should say is the great thing about being a faculty member is that when you decide you want to write a book about something, you begin teaching it, because that's the only way you're going to learn your subject. I began teaching a course on the history of anti-Semitism in 2019, when I realized that I needed to write this book. And this year, well, let me back up for a second. The course was always really diverse. I always had a really diverse population. In fact, when I was teaching it online during COVID, I had 3 students who were in China who were 12 hours ahead or behind us, behind the class in terms of time. But this year, something really striking has changed in the class. 2 things. One, and although I don't ask the students to self-identify, they all did in the course of our conversations, every Jewish student in my class has already experienced anti-Semitism. They came to American University bringing memories of anti-Semitism with them, which I know they are never going to forget, because that's what drove me into the book. The other thing that really struck me is that every single one of the students in the class who do not identify as Jewish are actually Catholic. They all went to Catholic school or were raised Catholic. And we build in this class a remarkable community, and they focus on learning about the history of anti-Semitism, a little bit about anti-Semitism in America, but we also spend a lot of time looking at anti-Semitism today. And they are some of my greatest allies, because I look at them and I think they're the future, and they're going to be able to help us get past this moment.
I also want you to talk about an experience you had earlier before the fair officially started. So you should know that Pam's book was selected among all the books by a program, an amazing program that the Miami Book Fair sponsors, which is to choose one book, buy 150 copies, and have a special program with students here at Miami-Dade College. And to the enormous credit of the organizer, Lizette and her team, they chose Pam's book to be the one to present to this student body, which of course most of you, being from this area, know is a predominantly non-Jewish student body. And so I think that's just amazing. So you had an experience Thursday afternoon with them, so tell us about that.
I had one of the most wonderful teaching experiences I have ever had, and I have to thank Lizette, the conference organizer, the book fair organizer for this. I teach in a very special university, and many of my students are extremely privileged. And here I was meeting a group of students who all are either immigrants or the children of immigrants, it seemed, based on the conversations I had. And I showed them, I kind of ran through anti-Semitism from 1654, when it started, as you said, all the way up to the anti-Semitism of the right and the left today. And they asked such extraordinary questions, and we had really deep conversations afterwards as I was signing their books, and they were so taken not only with understanding this hatred against a people that they really don't know much about, but they were also deeply trying to understand how much Christianity had contributed to the advancement of Jewish hate. And I was really moved by their conversations, by their curiosity, and I was also so moved by the fact that I was meeting people who I see as the future leaders of this country.
Very important. Let's stay on the campus, but actually shift to Congress about campus for a moment. So Pam has testified numerous times in front of Congress on the question of anti-Semitism, and this included the infamous December 2023 hearing, where you sat alongside the presidents of Harvard, MIT, and Penn. Maybe for those of you who watched that, now Pam looks familiar to you. Who was that other person on the panel? So tell us about that experience and what you were trying to convey to Congress in that context and what your takeaway was.
I was invited to testify in Congress in that now infamous hearing with the presidents. 2 of them lost their jobs. I'm thrilled to say nobody's tried to fire me so far. And I was there because the people who invited me knew that I was working on this book, and they thought that it would be useful to have something about anti-Semitism and its long history in America in my written remarks. When you go to testify in Congress, you write remarks and then you have to summarize them in 5 minutes in the hearing. And I was able to at least enter into the record, the historical record, some of this history that now appears in this book. But I also was well aware of a larger issue that was at play in that hearing. That hearing was, I believe, the opening attack on the universities in this country. The month before, then candidate Trump had announced that he was going to tax the endowments of the universities. He was going to use the funds that were generated to create a free online university, which would not be woke. This was all in a campaign video, and woke was the language that was used. And then those people would come and they would staff the federal government. And in that hearing, the presidents were asked about the size of their endowments, which is enormously large. They were asked about what was going on their campuses in terms of anti-Semitism. But ultimately, what happened once President Trump came into office is that he has used this, I think, essentially a fig leaf of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a problem on campus. I'm not saying it's not, but he's using anti-Semitism maybe as a wedge issue to go after the universities and essentially to cancel cancer grants and engineering grants and the great scientific research that these universities of ours do. And what really frightens me is that if our universities lose their position of preeminence in scientific and medical research in this country, and they lose it to China or some other country, that in the end, someone is going to remember that it happened because of the Jews.
It's definitely a complex issue. I mean, there are clearly people in the Jewish world who may not like that potential outcome, but feel whatever it was needed, that things have changed on campus as a result of that harsh tactic. How do you respond to them?
Things began to change on campus because, let's be honest about this, the universities realized they had an enormous problem and they had no way to solve it. When we think of the history of protests on campus, we think of the Vietnam War, we think of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, but that wasn't students against students. That was students acting against some other kind of political issue that might affect some of them, but not all of them. What happened on campus was we essentially had two groups of students arguing over each other. And the universities were just caught flat-footed. We all have student conduct codes, but student conduct codes, nobody really paid a whole lot of attention to them. And then the summer after the encampments, virtually every university that I was aware of began re-examining and rewriting its student conduct code. And I don't think it took a federal government to do that. That happened internally, because that was before they went after. That was before the election.
So there have been various responses to anti-Semitism, both in the American Jewish community and on the governmental level. So what do you see as the most effective responses?
The most effective responses historically have been legislation.
I'm sorry, have been?
Legislation. There's no question. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, but also declaring restrictive covenants which prohibited sales of property to Jews, declaring those unenforceable and ultimately illegal, Fair Employment Practices Acts. Those have been some of the most powerful changes and the ones that are really the most helpful. But I also do see that we know that anti-Semitism has historically spread through new technologies. The printing press allowed for the spreading of the idea of the blood libel. The radio allowed both the Nazis in Germany and Father Charles Coughlin in America to spread anti-Semitism. And now social media is the chief spreader of anti-Semitism. So if the federal government, or if the government can somehow figure out how to balance our right of free speech with what's going on social media, I think we would make a great advancement.
Do you see a role for Jewish organizations? I know that my own organization, Hadassah, has been involved on several levels, promoting Holocaust education, legislating anti-Semitism resolutions, using their physicians, nurses, and educators council to be actively involved in efforts to address anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in their fields. How important is the work of Jewish organizations?
The work of Jewish organizations is of fundamental importance, but let's be honest, Jews can't do this alone. Jewish people are, as you said, about 2% of the population of the United States. And anti-Semitism is often seen as a danger to democracy. And if we can solve some of the anti-Semitism problems, maybe we can also solve some of the concerns we have about our democratic republic, small d, small r.
So the last question I want to ask, and then we'll definitely open it up. I was walking through the airport in Philadelphia on my way here on Friday, and you know those corny signs that line the airports? Well, I saw one that actually struck me. It said, "Fear is contagious, so is hope." So I'd love for you to end on some hopeful note.
I can do that because as someone who's Jewish, I go back to the text, and Psalm 126 teaches us that those who sow in tears will reap in joy. And I think, just as you asked about Jewish organizations, just as I've been trying to encourage allies, that if we can lay the seeds to get past this moment, maybe we won't reap them in joy, but I hope my children and grandchildren will.
Thank you. I just very quickly want to encourage everybody to buy Pam's book if you haven't already. It's really an important read, especially as this conversation continues on many levels. And if you're not familiar with Hadassah, I know we've got some Hadassah people here, so thank you very much, my chevra. If you're not familiar with Hadassah, out on the table outside this room is information. There's a complimentary copy of the magazine. If any of you were here to hear Rabbi Bookdahl yesterday, she's on the cover of this issue, so you might want to pick that up. So thank you very much for coming.
And thank you, Lisa. That was wonderful.
Thank you, Pam.